He is a restorer. For 30 years, he pieced together other people's broken belongings and could spot a fake a mile away. Then he died beneath a burning beam and woke up in the body of a slave, in a world where power flows through glowing patterns on the wrists. And now he looks at the 7 shards of the immortal family chalice, for which he was sentenced to death, and understands what no one else in the room can see. This chalice was dead long before it fell. But let's go back. The cold of the stone floor hits David Cho in the cheek before his consciousness returns. A boot jabs him in the ribs. A voice from above lazily remarks that the empty one has fallen asleep on the move again, and it's time to toss him out with the slop. David opens his eyes and recognizes nothing. Not the ceiling, not his hands. His fingers are thin and dirty. His nails are broken down to the flesh. The skin is stretched so tight over his bones that it's about to burst. He inhales and starts coughing. The air is foreign. It smells of smoke and sourness. He is lying on stone slabs in a long corridor where torches burn every 10 paces and shadows tremble on the dark walls. He is not at home. He is not himself. His left wrist is burning, not with pain, but with something alive, something writhing beneath his skin. David raises his hand and sees a pattern, faded, almost worn away. Thin lines barely visible, like an old inscription on a well-worn coin. He doesn't know what it is, but his body knows. His body remembers this pattern and remembers the shame it carries. The boot strikes his ribs. A voice orders the empty shell to get up and carry the trays into the hall because Lord Vale's guests are already arriving. David stands up. His legs tremble. His knees buckle. His body is weak and alien. He is 16. He knows this by his hands, by his height, by the way the world seems too big. And in his past life, he was 26. He repaired furniture. He restored cracked vases. He glued together other people's memories from shards. And then, a burning beam, heat, darkness. And now, a stone floor and a foreign body. He doesn't scream. The restorers don't panic. They assess the damage. The man kicking him is large, with a red face, wearing an apron. A cook or a senior servant. The pattern on his wrist is denser, but also pale. He jabs a finger toward the noise and growls that if the empty one doesn't haul 20 trays to the feast, he'll sleep in the courtyard. David's lips move on their own and drop a word that this body has spoken 1,000 times. Yes, sir. His legs carry him to the left. His muscles remember the route. His hands remember how to grip the tray. And David's mind floats above it all like a passenger in someone else's boat. He lets the body lead. And he counts. Doors, turns, stairs, windows. A restorer always studies the space first. Before you repair, you have to understand where you are. The kitchen is sweltering. 3 stoves are blazing at once. People scurry between tables like ants in a ransacked nest. And they all have the same faint pattern on their wrists. Empty. The word itself surfaces in the body's memory. That's what they call people with the pale pattern. Those who aren't taught, aren't treated, aren't considered human. David grabs the first tray. Heavy silver, engraved cups. He lifts it with one hand and nearly drops it. He catches it with both, finds the center of gravity. 30 years of working with the fragile have taught him to feel the weight. His hands remember. Even these thin, unfamiliar hands. The main hall of the Vale family dazzles the eyes with the light of hundreds of candles. Long tables of dark wood, tapestries with patterns on the walls. But the patterns here aren't dull. They're golden, pulsing, alive. The guests are already seated. On every wrist, a dense, glowing pattern. David sets the tray on the edge of the table. No one looks at him. He's invisible, a piece of furniture, a thing without a price. He knows this feeling not from this body, but from his real life, to be a broken object on a shelf. But he remembers something else, too. Broken things aren't empty. There's always something in them. You just have to look the right way. He returns. A second tray, a third, a fourth. His back aches, his legs buzz, but his hands stay steady. Not a single cup clinks. On the seventh tray, he sees the host for the first time. Lord Cassian Vale sits at the head of the table, young, perhaps 30, a handsome, calm face, a gentle smile, a soft voice. He speaks with a guest about trade routes, and his words sound as smooth as music. The pattern on his wrist pulses so intensely that his hand seems to glow from within, the brightest thing in the room. David sets down the tray and stares intently at the pattern. And something stirs inside him. Not envy, not anger, something professional from a past life. When a client brought in a vase covered in a thick layer of varnish and called it an antique, David always felt the same thing. A quiet doubt. Because a real antique doesn't need such thick varnish. He looks at the Lord's pattern once more and turns away. On the 12th tray, something happens that ruins everything. The Lord's son, a guy in his 20s with a haughty face and a slack mouth, rises from the table. He's drunk. His movements are broad, his voice loud. He boasts to the guests of his family's grandeur. Their echo is the oldest on the continent. The blood of the Vales bears the pattern of 14 generations. He waves his hand. The cup sways in his fingers. And then he reaches toward the center of the table, where the family bowl of the lineage stands on a black stone stand. White, delicate, covered with a pattern so dense that the surface seems alive. It is 200 years old. It holds the founder's echo. It is immortal. The Lord's son grabs it with one hand, casually, as one takes what rightfully belongs to them. He raises it above his head to show the guests, and his fingers slip. The bowl falls. The sound is quiet, almost gentle. The white porcelain meets the stone and shatters into 7 pieces. The hall freezes. The silence is so complete that David can hear the candles crackling. The son's face turns from red to white. But Lord Cassian's expression does not change. He looks at the shards, then at his son. Then he slowly scans the hall with his eyes, and his gaze settles on David, on the skinny teenager by the wall with an empty tray. His son follows his father's gaze, and he understands everything. He points a finger at David and shouts that it was the servant who pushed him, that the boy deliberately stuck out his foot, that he saw that little rat sneak up from behind. David doesn't move. He stands against the wall 3 meters from the table. He physically could not have touched anyone, but that no longer matters. Not a single guest objects. Not a single servant looks up. Lord Cassian nods. To shatter the immortal chalice is a crime equal to an insult to the bloodline. The servant will be executed at dawn. His voice is just as soft and melodious as it was 10 minutes ago when he spoke of trade. Guards grab David by the shoulders and drag him toward the exit. He doesn't resist. Not because he has resigned himself to his fate, but because his gaze is fixed on the floor. To the 7 shards of white porcelain on the dark stone. He sees the lines of fracture. He sees the cracks radiating from the center. And he sees what no one else in the hall sees. The bowl did not shatter from the impact. It was dead long before it fell. The cracks came from within. Fine. Old. The heirloom pattern had long since turned into an hollow shell. Beautiful, bright, dead. Like a thick layer of varnish on a fake antique. They throw him into a stone cell beneath the estate. Small, damp, windowless. The door slams shut. Darkness. And in that darkness, David Cho smiles for the first time in this new world. He's seen worse. 7 shards is nothing. There have been as many as 20. All he needs is the night. And the shards. The darkness in the stone cell was thick. So thick it seemed he could touch it with his hands. David sat on the cold floor and waited. Not for death. For shards. He knew they would come, because in every big house there is a person tasked with cleaning up after the owners, and that person always comes at night. Footsteps sounded an hour later, maybe 2. Time flowed differently here. The door creaked. The dim light of a torch stung his eyes. A woman stood in the doorway. Not young, thin, her hands red from work. The mark on her wrist was pale, like all the servants. She set a wooden tray on the floor. On it lay 7 shards of white porcelain, and a piece of stale bread. She said the head chef had ordered the shards to be given to the empty one. He said, let him cut himself and die before dawn. It would be less of a fuss. The woman didn't look him in the eye. She had already turned to leave. David thanked her. She stopped, turned around, looked at him the way people look at a madman. Then she left. The door slammed again. Darkness returned. But everything he needed was lying on the tray. David moved closer. A torch in the hallway cast a thin strip of light through the crack under the door. That was enough. He laid the shards out before him, 7 pieces. He remembered the shape of the bowl, a wide rim, a narrow bottom, the smooth curve of the sides, 2 large fragments, 3 medium ones, 2 small ones. A classic radio break. In a past life, he would have grabbed some epoxy and gold powder. Here, he had nothing. Only his hands. And that strange sensation in his wrist. He picked up the first shard, the largest one, brought it to his eyes. And the world changed. He didn't know what to call it. Not sight, not hearing, something in between. As if the shard were telling him its story, not with words, but with sensations. He saw the tension within the material, lines of force, points of concentration, and cracks. Not those 7 cracks along which the bowl had shattered on the floor of the banquet hall. Others, ancient ones, as thin as a spider web. They came from within, dozens, hundreds, microscopic fractures accumulating year after year, decade after decade. The bowl had been dying for 100 years. The inherited pattern on it was like gilding on rotten wood, shiny on the outside, rotten on the inside. David set down a shard and picked up the next one. Same story. And the next. And the next. By the 4th shard, he already understood everything. The bowl was created by a master with a true echo, not inherited, but lived. A man who knew what labor was, and what pain was, and what resilience was. His pattern was fused into the vessel's walls, and 200 years ago, the bowl truly sang. But then, generation after generation, its owners poured their inherited echo into it. A stranger's. A dead one. As if someone were covering a crack in an antique vase with cheap putty, layer upon layer. Each layer pressed down on the one before it. Each killed the bowl a little more, until it became what it became. A dead, beautiful fake. David closed his eyes. He held the shards in his hands and listened to them, not with his ears, with something else, with what had appeared within him when he woke up on the stone floor of this world. He listened and understood, and the more he understood, the more clearly he felt the warmth in his wrist growing. A delicate pattern on his skin pulsed, barely noticeable, like a heartbeat. He began to work, without tools, without glue, without gold dust, only with his hands. He took 2 large shards and aligned them. The fracture lines matched perfectly. He pressed them together and concentrated. The warmth from his wrist flowed into his fingers, slowly, like honey. He directed it into the seam, without rushing, without forcing, allowing the warmth to find its own path. The seam glowed, dimly, barely noticeable. But David felt how the 2 pieces of dead porcelain ceased to be 2. They became 1. And a line appeared at the point of connection, warm, golden. His line. His echo. Not inherited, lived. 30 years of working with his hands, thousands of hours with glue and a brush, hundreds of saved objects. All of it was here, in a thin, glowing line on white porcelain. Kintsugi, the art of repairing with gold. Not hiding the crack, but making it beautiful. Not pretending the break never happened, but showing that the object had become stronger. He continued. The 3rd shard, the 4th, the 5th. His hands trembled with fatigue. A teenager's body wasn't used to such concentration. Sweat rolled down his forehead. But David didn't stop. Every seam demanded his full attention. Every stitch demanded understanding. He couldn't just glue it back together. He had to understand why it had cracked right here. What was pressing down? What was breaking it? And every time, the answer was the same. A foreign, dead echo superimposed over the living. He didn't scrape it away. He didn't fight it. He did what he always did. He found, beneath the layers of the dead pattern, the remnants of the real, of that very first master. And he joined his seams with his lines. The old living echo and the new living echo met like 2 streams and flowed together. By the 3rd hour of work, the bowl was almost assembled. 6 shards in place, was becoming the 7th, the smallest, a piece from the neck, and the most difficult. Because it was precisely here that the concentration of the dead echo was at its highest. The masters drank from this neck, touched it with their lips, and poured most of their empty legacy into it. David took the shard, listened, and for the first time that night, he stopped. Beneath the layers of the dead pattern, he heard a cry, quiet, ancient. The first master had put something special into this neck, not just an echo, a voice. The chalice was created to sing. 200 years ago, it sang when they drank from it, and then they forced it to be silent, filled it with something foreign, suffocated. David's fingers trembled, not from fatigue, from anger. The quiet, professional anger of a restorer who sees that a masterpiece has been destroyed not by time, but by neglect. He pressed the last shard into place. He directed the heat. The seam glowed brighter than the rest. The neck fell into place. The bowl was whole. But it was not the same. 7 golden lines crisscrossed the white porcelain like rivers on a map. Each seam glowed softly and evenly, not brightly, not garishly, like the setting sun. The dead, inherited pattern still covered the walls, but now the living shone through it. The present. 2 echoes, the old masters and the new ones, interwoven in the seams. David lifted the bowl, brought it to his lips, and blew into the rim. The bowl sang, quietly, gently, like a bell. The sound was thin and clear. It filled the stone cell and seeped through the cracks in the door. David set the bowl on the tray, lay down on the floor, and fell asleep. For the first time in the new world, he slept peacefully. His hands ached. His back throbbed. His body was as empty as a wrung-out rag, but inside, it was warm. A familiar warmth. The very same one he felt every time he saved an object from the trash. When he turned trash into treasure. When he proved that broken didn't mean dead. Behind the door in the hallway stood that very same female servant. She had come to collect the tray. She heard the singing of the bowl, and she stood motionless, her hand pressed to her chest. There were tears in her eyes. She didn't know why. Dawn came with the clang of a lock. The door of the stone cell opened, and 2 guards stood in the doorway. Behind them was the head chef, the one with the red face. He said it was time. That Lord Vale had ordered the empty one to be brought into the courtyard and executed before breakfast, so as not to spoil anyone's appetite afterward. David stood up. He was holding the bowl in his hands. The guards didn't immediately realize what it was. Then one of them looked more closely and took a step back. The head cook opened his mouth and didn't close it. The bowl was intact. White porcelain crisscrossed by 7 golden lines. The seams glowed softly in the dungeon's dim light, and a sound was coming from it. Quiet, on the verge of audibility, as if it were humming on its own. David said he wanted to see the Lord. The guard said that the empty were not allowed to want. David raised the bowl a little higher. The light from the seams fell on the guard's face. He fell silent. They led him upstairs. Not to the courtyard for execution, to the main hall. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows. The table was set for breakfast. The guests hadn't left yet. Most had spent the night at the estate. They sat at the table, worn out from the night before, sluggish, sleepy. Lord Cassian Vale sat in the same spot as yesterday, as if he hadn't gotten up, as if he hadn't slept. His face was fresh, his smile was gentle. The pattern on his wrist pulsed. His son sat beside him, pale, eyes red. He had clearly slept poorly. David entered the hall accompanied by guards, barefoot, dirty, in the torn clothes of a servant. He was the smallest and thinnest person in the hall, but he held in his hands something that made the hall fall silent. The first to react came from a woman in a blue dress. She was sitting 3 chairs away from the Lord. She saw the bowl. She recognized it, and she dropped her spoon into her plate. The clatter of the spoon caught the attention of the others. Heads turned. One by one, the guests noticed the white porcelain with gold trim in the thin servant's hands, and one by one, they fell silent. Lord Cassian looked at David, then at the bowl. His smile remained unchanged, but his eyes had changed. Something cold and watchful had appeared in them, like that of a man who sees a mistake in his calculations. David approached the table. He placed the bowl on that very black stone stand, carefully, gently, just as he had placed every restored object in his past life. He said the bowl was intact, that he had repaired it overnight, and that it sang again. One of the guests, a man with a thick beard and a very dense pattern on his wrist, leaned toward the bowl. He reached out and touched one of the seams and pulled his fingers back. He said it was impossible, that the seam was warm, that there was a living echo within it, that an empty one could not have placed a living echo in the seam because empty ones have no echo. The hall grew noisy. Voices rose. Someone stood up from the table to get a closer look. Lord Cassian raised his hand. The hall fell silent. He looked at David and asked how he had done it. His voice was just as soft, just as melodious, but there was a note in it that hadn't been there yesterday. Interest, or calculation, or both. David answered simply. He said he had listened, that the bowl had told him where it hurt, and that he had sealed the stitches with what he had. The Lord asked what exactly he had. David showed his wrist, a faint pattern, barely visible. Someone in the hall smirked. The Lord did not smirk. He looked at David's wrist, and his eyes narrowed. The Lord's son jumped to his feet. He said it was a fake, that the empty one had stolen someone else's material and plastered it onto the shards, that a real bowl could not be repaired by a servant, that it was an insult to the family. The Lord raised his hand again. The son sat down. The Lord said there was a simple way to check. He ordered water to be brought. A servant brought a jug. The Lord himself poured water into the cup, to the brim. Everyone watched. The cup held. Not a single drop seeped through the seams. And then Cassian raised the cup to his lips. He took a sip. And the bowl began to sing. Not softly, as in the dungeon, loudly. The sound filled the hall, clear, high-pitched, and so vivid that several guests felt goosebumps run down their skin. This sound had not been heard for 200 years. None of the living had heard it, but everyone recognized it. Because the body remembers what the family remembers. And the body of every aristocrat in that hall knew that the family bowls had once sung, and that they had since fallen silent. And no one had ever asked why. Lord Cassian set the bowl down. He wiped his lips and looked at David with a long gaze. The hall was silent. In that silence, the Lord's son spoke again. He said that even if Empty had repaired the cup, he was still guilty. That the destruction of a relic is punishable by death. That repair does not negate the crime. The Lord looked at his son, and for the first time that morning, his smile widened slightly. He said that his son was right, that the law is the law, but that executing the only person capable of repairing immortal objects would be a waste. He looked at the guests and proposed a compromise. The empty servant would be transferred from the kitchen to the estate's workshop. He would repair whatever he was ordered to. If he refused or fled, the execution would simply be postponed, not canceled. The guests nodded. Reasonable, practical, even elegant. Lord Vale's mercy. David stood and listened as they decided his fate. From a man sentenced to death, he became a man sentenced to labor. From an idle servant, he became an idle craftsman. The cage became more spacious, but it remained a cage. He didn't object, not because he was satisfied, but because a cage with tools is better than a cage without them. They led him to the workshop, a small room in the east wing, a workbench, shelves, tools, rough but functional, a stone floor, a single narrow window, a cat on a shelf. It was better than a dungeon. It was better than death. David ran his hand over the workbench. The wood was old, dry, but sturdy. His hands remembered surfaces like this. He examined the tools: hammers, chisels, whetstones, pliers. Nothing for delicate work, all for brute force. A blacksmith's workshop, not a restorer's. But it was a start. There was a note on the workbench, simple, 3 words. First task in the morning. At the bottom was a seal bearing the Vale family crest. David put the note down, sat on the floor, leaned against the wall. And for the first time since waking up in this world, he asked himself the question he'd been putting off. What's going on? He's in a foreign world, in a foreign body, with a foreign destiny. He has an ability he doesn't understand. There is a master who views him as a useful tool. There is a death sentence hanging over him like a leash. And there are hands that remember how to repair things. That's enough. That's enough for today. He closed his eyes, and before falling asleep, he thought about how, in his past life, his workshop had also started with a stranger's corner and stranger's tools. And so what? He managed. His first task awaited him the next morning. A guard brought a wooden box and set it on the workbench without a word. Inside lay a sword, or rather what had once been a sword. The blade was cracked from the hilt to the middle of the edge. A long, deep crack ran across the entire surface like lightning frozen in metal. A note lay nearby. It said that the sword belonged to the captain of the Lord's personal guard, that the blade had cracked 3 days ago during training, that 4 blacksmiths had already examined it, and all said the same thing: hopeless, remelting. David picked up the sword, heavy, good steel, proper balance. Someone had forged it with skill. He ran his finger along the crack and felt it again. Warmth in his wrist. The world opened up. The crack became history. He saw how the metal had grown weary, how tension had built up in the molecules year after year, how micro cracks had spread out from the center. And he saw why. The sword had been forged by a master with an inherited echo. He forged well, technically, but without understanding. He poured his pattern into the blade as one might pour paint into water, thoughtlessly, generously, and the metal couldn't take it. It wasn't made for that much dead echo. David worked for 3 hours. He didn't reforge it. He didn't remelt it. He listened to the metal. He found the points of tension, and one by one, he removed them. He drew the dead echo out through the edges of the crack, and then he sealed the seam with his own. When he finished, the crack had turned into a thin golden line running from the hilt to the middle of the blade. The sword became lighter. The balance shifted. But when David swung it, the air sang. Softly, briefly, like a sigh. He put the sword back in the box. The guard took it. That evening, David heard someone practicing with a sword in the courtyard. Strike after strike. Fast, hard, without pause. And then silence. And someone's voice said that the blade had changed. Faster, more precise, as if it knew where to strike. The second task arrived the next day. A mahogany box. The lid wouldn't close. The hinges were intact. The lock was intact. But the lid wouldn't fit into place, as if the box itself didn't want to close. David listened to it. The box belonged to the Lord's wife, his ex-wife. She had died 3 years ago. And echo was yearning inside the box. Literally, the wood remembered its mistress's touch. It remembered the warmth of her fingers, and without her, it could not be whole. David didn't fix the hinges. He didn't adjust the lid. He sat down next to the box and stayed there for 2 hours, just listening. And then he placed in the seam between the lid and the body not just his own echo, but the echo of memory. He remembered how, in a past life, he had repaired an old dresser for an elderly woman. She had cried when she saw that her husband's dresser stood level again. He placed that feeling into the wood. Not his own sorrow, not someone else's, but the understanding that objects remember those who loved them. The box closed, quietly, gently, as if it had exhaled. On the 3rd day, there were no assignments, nor on the 4th. David sat in the workshop, sharpening tools, studying materials, trying to understand the limits of his abilities. The pattern on his wrist had grown slightly denser after the bowl and the sword, just a little, but he could see the difference. Every repair added a line. Every task brought to completion thickened the pattern. On the 5th day, it wasn't a guard who came to him. A girl came to him. She stood in the doorway of the workshop and looked at him with an expression as if she were solving a problem that had no answer. Tall, thin, black hair cut short, simple but high-quality clothing. Not a servant, not an aristocrat. Something in between. A mercenary. He could tell by the way she stood, by the way her weight was distributed between both feet, by the way her right arm hung at her side slightly farther from her hip than her left. Ready, even now. A pattern on her wrist. Faded, but not from birth. It had faded, like paint in the sun. It had once been vivid. She was silent for a full minute. Then she said her name was So-Yun, that she was captain of Lord Vale's personal guard, that it was her sword he had repaired. David nodded. She said the sword had become different. Not better, not worse. Different. She said the blade used to obey her, but now it was as if it were talking to her, and she didn't know if she liked it or if it frightened her. David said that was normal, that a repaired object always speaks, because it now has a history. So-Yun looked at him for a long time. Then she asked how much he wanted for the work. David didn't understand the question. She repeated it. How much? Gold, silver, food, a favor, whatever he takes. David said nothing. So-Yun didn't believe him. You could tell by the way her jaw clenched, by the way her eyes narrowed. She said nothing is free, that everything has a price, that if not with money, then something else, and that it's better for her to know the price in advance than to get the bill when she least expects it. David was silent for a moment. Then he said, "There's no payment in his work, because it's not a service. It's a repair. And a repair is when you make something whole not for yourself, but for the thing itself." So-Yun stood in the doorway for another minute. Then she turned and left. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say goodbye. She just left. Like someone who had received an answer they couldn't accept. David stayed in the workshop. He thought about her wrist, about the faded pattern. He'd seen it in the bowl and in the sword. A dead echo superimposed over the living. But with So-Yun, it was different. With her, the dead hadn't been superimposed over the living. With her, the living had been taken away, scooped out, like water is scooped from a well, leaving a dry bottom. He didn't yet know how that was possible, but he knew what he had seen. So-Yun wasn't empty from birth. She had been emptied. The next day she came again, silently. She stood in the doorway, watched him work. An hour later she left. The next day again, and again. The 4th time David couldn't take it anymore and asked if she wanted to come inside. "There's a chair in there." So-Yun came in. She sat down, and sat in silence for another hour. Then she said that his workshop was the first place in the estate that didn't reek of flattery. David almost laughed, but he kept quiet, because he understood. She hadn't come for the sword. She had come for the silence, for a place where no one expected anything from her. And that, too, was a kind of repair, a different kind. On the 10th day at the estate, rumors about the empty workshop spread through all the corridors. The servants whispered in the kitchen. The grooms discussed it by the stables. Even the old gardener, with his trembling hands and completely empty wrist, once stopped at the workshop door and stood silently for a full minute before leaving. The story of the chalice grew with details. Half of them were made up. They said that the empty servant had gathered the relic from the dust with his bare hands. They said that the chalice didn't just sing, but uttered the name of the family's founder. They said Lord Vale turned pale. The last part was a lie. Lord Vale never turned pale. David worked. Assignments came in every day. A cracked candlestick, a doctor's split mortar, a broken cloak clasp. Small things, everyday items, but each with its own story, each with its own crack. And he listened to each one before touching it. The candlestick was silent. It was a simple object without an echo, and David repaired it in the usual way. He soldered it, he filed it down, he smoothed it out. His hands remembered. The doctor's mortar proved more complicated. It contained a foreign echo, a faint one, a residual, the echo of the doctor who had used it. David preserved it and wove it into the seam. When the mortar was returned to the doctor, he was grinding herbs in it and suddenly froze, because the mortar had grown warm beneath his fingers, as if alive. The pattern on David's wrist was growing, slowly, along the repair line, but it grew. And with each new line, he felt the world a little more clearly. Cracks were appearing not only in objects, he was beginning to see them in the stone of the walls, in the wood of the door frames, in the metal of the grills. The world around him was covered in cracks. And the further he went, the clearer it became to him that the cracks were not random. They followed a single pattern, as if the entire estate were slowly crumbling from within, like that bowl. On the 12th day, So-Yun did not come alone. A man followed her, young, about 25, broad-shouldered. His hands were large and rough, the hands of a blacksmith, but not the face of a blacksmith. The face of a man who had been beaten, not with fists, with words, with contempt, for years. The pattern on his wrist was faded, but his hands were the hands of a master. David saw it right away, from the calluses, from the burns, from the way his fingers moved, confidently, precisely, even when their owner was trembling with fear. So-Yun said this was Ren, the estate's blacksmith, or rather the blacksmith's assistant, because one cannot be a blacksmith alone. She said Ren wanted to ask for something but was afraid. Ren didn't look at David. He stared at the floor, and his hands clenched and unclenched. David pulled out a chair, said he would sit down. Ren sat down. So-Yun remained standing by the door, like a guard. Ren was silent for 3 minutes. Then he pulled a bundle from his bosom. He unwrapped it. Inside were fragments. A small hammer, almost a child's. The handle was made of light wood. The head was made of dark steel, broken in half. The handle had cracked and the head had flown off. Ren said it was his father's hammer, that his father had taught him to forge with this hammer when Ren was 7, that his father had been a blacksmith in the lower city, a real one, without an inherited echo. He forged through hard work and sweat, and his blades were good, not the best, but honest. And then the Lord's men came. They said that an empty one had no right to forge, that blades without an inherited echo were dangerous, that it was a fraud and an insult to the craft. They took the workshop. They took the tools. They took his father. Ren didn't know what became of him. The hammer was the only thing left. Ren had carried it with him for 10 years. And 3 days ago, the estate's head blacksmith saw it and snatched it from his hands. Said that an empty one wasn't allowed to have a master's tools. Broke it and threw it away. Ren said this, staring at the floor. His voice was even, dry, as if he were retelling someone else's story. But his hands clenched the shards so tightly that his knuckles turned white. David picked up the hammer. 2 halves. The handle and the head. A clean break. The wood was old but sturdy, the steel was good, and the echo, there was an echo in this little hammer. faint, warm, alive. The echo of a man who forged not for status, but for the sake of the work. David worked under Ren. He didn't hide the process. He wanted Ren to see. He took the fragments, aligned them, pressed them together, and directed the heat from his wrist into the seam. A golden line ran through the handle, thin, neat. The head snapped into place. But David didn't stop. He found in the metal the echo of Ren's father, touched it, awoke it, and wove it into the seam next to his own. Two echoes, the old blacksmith and the new restorer, intertwined. The hammer became whole. The seam on the handle glowed, barely noticeable, like a vein on a leaf. David held out the hammer to Ren. Ren took it, with both hands, as one would take something fragile, as one would take something sacred. He gripped the handle, and the hammer hummed, quietly, briefly, like a greeting. Ren raised his head. For the first time during the entire conversation, he looked David in the eyes. And David saw that Ren's eyes were wet. Ren said it was his. His voice broke. He said it as a question, as if he didn't believe it, as if he were waiting for someone to say it was a joke, or to name a price. David nodded. Ren stood up. He pressed the hammer to his chest and walked out. So-Yun was standing by the door. She looked at David. Then she said quietly that he was a dangerous man. David asked why. She said it was because he gave people hope. And hope, in this world, is the cruelest thing. David thought for a moment. Then he replied that hope is cruel only when it is false. And he doesn't give false hope. He gives a fix. So-Yun snorted. It was the first sound resembling laughter he had ever heard from her. She left. And David remained sitting in the workshop, thinking. About the hammer. About Renee. About Renee's father who had been taken away. The blacksmith from the lower city. Empty. He forged without an inherited echo. And his blades were good. Not the best, but honest. And for that, they destroyed him. Because if an empty can forge good blades, then why is the hereditary pattern needed? If labor yields results without the echo of blood, then the entire hierarchy is a lie. David understood, not with his mind, with his gut. This world isn't just unfair. It's built on a foundation that's cracked, and the crack widens with every generation. The inherited echo fades. The things of the nobility break. Blades shatter. Bowls fall silent. The world is crumbling. And no one wants to look down at the foundation. Because if they look, it will become clear that the foundation has been stolen. That the echo cannot be inherited, that it can only be lived. That evening, David left the workshop for the first time without being ordered to. He walked down the corridor to the east wall of the estate. There was a window there, narrow, barred. Through it, the lower city was visible. Roofs, smoke, lights, people below. Thousands of empty ones. Thousands of people with dull wrists. Each of them could have lived out their own echo. Each could have filled the pattern not with the blood of their ancestors, but with their own labor. But they weren't given a chance. David stood by the window and looked out at the city. His hands rested on the stone windowsill. His left wrist bore a pattern that had grown slightly denser over these 12 days. He thought that he didn't need this workshop. He needed his own. Down there, among the empty ones. But that was a long way off. For now, he had a workbench, tools, tasks, and a female warrior who came every day to sit in silence, and a blacksmith who, for the first time in 10 years, holds his father's hammer in his hands. That's enough for a start. Behind him in the workshop, on the workbench, stood a bowl. Lord Vale had returned it to David. He said that a repaired object should be near the one who repaired it. Generosity. Or a leash. The bowl hummed quietly in the empty workshop, as if humming to itself, as if glad it wasn't alone. At the end of the 3rd week, Lord Cassian Vale summoned David to his chambers, not to the main hall, to his study. A room on the top floor, dark wood, heavy curtains, books on the shelves, maps on the walls, the smell of ink, and something sweet. Cassian sat at the table and looked at David with that same gaze, gentle, attentive, calculating. He said he was impressed, that the bowl was still singing, that So Yun's sword had become better than it was, that the healer couldn't tear himself away from the mortar. He spoke of it calmly, as if talking about the weather, and then he placed a scroll on the table, unrolled it. A list. 12 items. Names, descriptions, owners, all from noble families, all cracked or broken. Cassian said that if David repaired all 12, he would receive the status of master in the House of Vale. Not a servant, not a slave. A master, with his own room, with his own salary, with the right to leave the estate. David looked at the list, then at Cassian, and asked what would happen to the postponed execution. Cassian smiled. He said that masters aren't executed, that it would be bad form. David understood what that meant. The execution isn't cancelled, it just becomes unprofitable. As long as he's useful, he lives. As soon as he ceases to be useful, the sentence will return. He took the list. He nodded. He returned to the workshop. So Yun was waiting by the door. She asked what the Lord wanted. David showed her the list. So Yun read it. Her face didn't change, but the fingers of her right hand twitched toward her hip, where her sword usually hung. She said that half the items on the list belonged to the Lord's allies, that by repairing them, David would bind these houses to the Vales more tightly than any treaty, that the Lord wasn't granting him freedom, the Lord was buying himself power through his hands. David nodded. He knew. But he had no choice, for now. First on the list was the Tarnov family shield, old, battle-worn, split in two during some battle 20 years ago. They brought it 3 days later, 2 pieces of wood and metal wrapped in an oil-stained rag. David unwrapped it, listened, and for the first time encountered something he hadn't expected. The shield was screaming. Not literally, not with a sound, but the echo inside it was so loud and so painful that David pulled his hands away. Inside the shield was the echo of a warrior, of the man who had held it in his final battle. The man had died, but the shield remembered. It remembered the blow, it remembered the pain, it remembered the moment when the hand opened and the shield fell. And for years that scream lived inside the split wood. David sat in front of the shield all day. He didn't touch it. He listened. He learned to hear not only the cracks in the material, but also the cracks in memory. By evening, he understood. The shield didn't want to be repaired. It wanted to be heard. He worked all night, without rushing, without forcing it. First, he let echo scream itself out. He simply held the shards in his hands and let the pain flow through him. It was hard. His body trembled. His head was splitting. He felt another's death as his own. A blow to the chest, the crunch of ribs. Darkness. And then he let go, gently, like letting go of a sleeping child's hand. The pain was gone. It hadn't vanished, but it had subsided. And then he began to heal it. A seam ran across the entire surface of the shield, golden, bright, brighter than on the chalice, because it contained not only David's echo, but also the warrior's echo. Cleansed of pain, left behind as a memory. The shield no longer screamed. It was silent. But it was silent in peace, like a man who had finally spoken his mind. When the shield was taken back to Tarnum, David was lying on the workshop floor and couldn't get up. His body was failing him. His hands were shaking. The pattern on his wrist throbbed painfully. He had given too much. So Yun found him like that, on the floor, pale, with his eyes closed. She didn't call a doctor. She sat down beside him, leaned against the wall, and sat in silence until he opened his eyes. Then she said he was an idiot, that you can't pour yourself into every single thing until you're completely drained, that he'd die before he finished the list. David smiled wryly, and said that he didn't know how to do it any other way, that if you fix things half-heartedly, you end up with a half-fix, and a half-fix is worse than broken. So Yun shook her head. She handed him a flask of water. He drank. Then she handed him a piece of bread. He ate it. Then she stood up and said she'd bring proper food tomorrow, because on bread and water alone, the master would be dead. It was the first time she'd shown concern openly. David didn't comment on it. He knew that if he paid attention to the crack too soon, it might close up forever. Second on the list was the Maywood family harp. Small, a table harp. 3 strings were broken. The body was intact, but the sound was dead. A messenger had brought the harp, a young guy with shifty eyes. He said Lady Maywood asked for it to be fixed quickly, that she plays the harp every evening, that without the harp, she can't sleep. David took the harp. He listened and frowned. The harp was strange. The 3 broken strings weren't snapped. They had been cut from the inside. The echo within the harp was devouring itself. The inherent pattern conflicted with the material. The wood was pulling in one direction, the echo in the other. And at the junction, the strings snapped. He repaired the harp for 2 days. Not the strings, the conflict. He stripped away the dead inherited echo layer by layer, as if he were stripping old varnish. Beneath it, he found living wood, pure, resonant. He strung new strings made from the material Wren had given him. The blacksmith turned out to be more useful than expected. He knew how to draw wire. Thin, smooth, made of good metal. The harp sang. Not like before. Differently. More clearly, without a strain. When they took it away, David thought Lady Maywood would be surprised. The harp no longer lulled. It awakened. The day after the harp, Amber Reed came to the workshop. David didn't know who she was. Red-haired, 19 years old. Her eyes were fierce and bright. Her clothes were worn, but had once been expensive. She stood in the doorway and spoke quickly, almost without pauses. She said she'd heard about the empty workshop, that she'd come from far away, that she needed help, and that if he refused, she'd find him and make him. So Yun, who was sitting in her usual chair, slowly placed her hand on the hilt of her sword. Amber looked at her, then at the sword, then back at David, and added that she would make him do it politely. David asked what she needed. Amber pulled a long bundle from behind her back. She unwrapped it. A blade. Or what used to be a blade. The steel was gray, dull, without a single glint. The blade was intact, no cracks, no chips, but dead. Absolutely dead, like stone. She said that this was her father's last blade, that her father had been a blacksmith, that his blades used to sing, that he forged better than many renowned masters, and then one day the blades fell silent, all at once, as if someone had turned off the sound. Her father tried again and again. He forged day and night, but the steel remained silent. They called him a failure. They took away his workshop. The family was ruined. Her father broke down. This blade was the last thing he made. Amber fell silent. Her hands clenched the bundle. Her knuckles were white. Her jaw was clenched. She wasn't crying. She was too angry to cry. David took the blade. He touched the steel and froze. There was no dead echo in the blade. There was no echo in it at all. Zero. Emptiness. As if someone had scooped it all out down to the last drop. Just like with So-Yun. He looked at Amber, then at So-Yun. Two voids of the same kind, one in a person, the other in an object. Someone was taking the echo, not losing it, taking it. He told Amber he needed time. She asked how much. He said he didn't know. She said she would stay and wait. So-Yun said the workshop wasn't a hotel. Amber said she'd noticed, and that at least a hotel had a chair. So-Yun silently pushed her chair aside and stood up. Amber sat down. They looked at each other. The air between them grew thick. David thought this was going to be interesting. Amber's father's blade had been lying on the workbench for 3 days. David hadn't touched it. He was thinking. He saw the cracks. He knew how to read the history of objects. But what had happened to this blade wasn't a crack. It was a robbery. Someone had come and taken everything, not broken it, not ruined it. Taken it. Like a thief who carries out not furniture, but air from a house. Leaving the walls, leaving the roof, but taking away life. Amber spent the night in the stable. So-Yun didn't object. David suspected that So-Yun had arranged it herself, because on the second day, Amber showed up in the workshop with a blanket that was only given to guards. Amber was impossible. She talked nonstop. She asked questions without waiting for answers. She fiddled with the tools on the workbench. She twirled stones and hammers in her hands. She dropped them, she apologized, and then she'd drop them again right away. So-Yun sat in her chair and watched her like a cat watches a fly, with patience that was about to run out. But David saw something else. Beneath all that noise, beneath the chatter, beneath the bravado, Amber was afraid. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold, from terror. She was the daughter of a blacksmith who had been broken, and she was afraid that David would look at the blade and say the same thing everyone else had said. Hopeless. Recast. On the 4th morning, David took the blade. He called Amber, told her to sit beside him, and said he needed her help. Amber was at a loss. For the first time ever, she didn't know what to say. David explained. The blade was empty. The echo was gone, but traces remained. Like fingerprints on glass, like a scent in a room after someone has left. To read these traces, he needed to know what the original was like. He asked Amber to tell him, not about the blade, about her father, how he worked, how he held the hammer, what his face looked like when the metal sang. Amber began to speak, slowly, not like usual, without arrogance, without a shield. She told how her father would rise before dawn, how he stoked the fire in the furnace himself, always by himself. How he checked the temperature not with a thermometer, but with his hand. He'd hold his palm up to the metal and just knew. How he'd strike with the hammer evenly, rhythmically, for hours. How he'd hum something under his breath with every blow. The same melody. She didn't remember the words, she only remembered the rhythm. Ta-ta-tam, ta-ta-tam. She paused, swallowed something, and continued. She said that when the blades fell silent, her father didn't eat for 3 days. He sat by the forge and stared at the coals. And then he began to forge again and again. He struck the steel with his hammer until his hands began to bleed, but the steel remained silent. And one day he simply stopped. He sat down and didn't get up. Amber fell silent. David didn't say anything. He placed his hand on the blade, closed his eyes, and began to search. Imprints, traces. What the thief couldn't take because it wasn't an echo, but a memory. The physical memory of the metal. Every blow of the hammer left a mark in the steel's structure. Not magical, physical. Microscopic deformations. The pattern of the metal grains. And in that pattern, David found a rhythm. Ta-ta-tam, ta-ta-tam. The blacksmith's melody fused into his last blade. David opened his eyes. He knew what to do. But he couldn't do it alone. He called Ren. The blacksmith arrived an hour later, with his father's hammer tucked into his belt. David told him he needed a forge, not a big one, a small one, just big enough to heat a single blade. Ren nodded and left. By evening, a small, portable forge stood in the corner of the workshop, assembled from stones and clay. Rough, but functional. So-Yun brought the coal, without asking, without explaining. She just set the sack by the door and left. David lit the forge. He placed the blade in the fire. He waited. When the steel had heated to the right color, he pulled the blade out with tongs and turned to Ren. He said, "Strike." Ren didn't understand. David explained. The rhythm. Ta-ta-tam. Amber's father had hammered that rhythm into every blade, and that rhythm was his echo. Not inherited, lived. The rhythm of thousands of hours by the forge, the rhythm of a master. If the rhythm is returned to the metal, the echo will remember. Ren took his hammer, a small one, a child's, with a golden seam on the handle, and he struck. Ta-ta-tam. Amber sat nearby. She looked at the blade, at the fire, at Ren, at David, and her lips moved silently. She was counting the rhythm. That very one. Ta-ta-tam. Ren struck. David held the blade and directed heat from his wrist into the metal. He wasn't healing a crack. There was no crack. He was filling the void, slowly, drop by drop, like pouring water into a dry well. And with every blow, he felt something in the steel respond. Quietly, faintly, like an echo in an empty room. They worked for 3 hours. Ren struck with the hammer until his hands went numb. David held the blade until his fingers lost all feeling. Amber sat nearby and said nothing. For the first time ever, she was silent not out of fear, but because she was witnessing a miracle. With the final blow, the blade sighed. The sound was quiet, brief, but all three of them heard it. The steel came to life. It didn't sing. It didn't ring out. It simply ceased to be dead. David laid the blade on the workbench. The edge glowed dimly in the twilight. Not gold like it seems. A different color. Warm. Reddish. The color of fire in a furnace. He held out the blade to Amber. She took it, with both hands, just as Ren had taken the hammer, just as one takes what has been lost and found. And the blade hummed, quietly, steadily. Ta-ta-tam. Her father's melody, returning from the void. Amber pressed the blade to her chest. She wasn't crying. She was too angry to cry. But her eyes were wet, and her voice broke when she said she owed him. David said she didn't. Amber said she did owe him, and that there was nothing he could do about it. So-Yun, standing in the doorway, gave a quiet chuckle. For the second time. It was becoming a habit. That night, David lay on the workshop floor and stared at the ceiling. His body ached. The pattern on his wrist throbbed, but his mind was clear. He thought about what he had seen in the blade. Emptiness. Pure. Absolute. Someone had taken the echo from the metal, just as they had taken it from So-Yun. And he was beginning to understand that this was no accident, not an illness, not a curse. It was a system. Someone was collecting other people's echoes, and that someone very much did not want anyone to find out. By the end of the first month at the estate, David had repaired 6 items from Cassian's list: the shield, the harp, the Sylvain family mirror, the Hargreaves family quill, the Crane family medallion, and the Blackwood family necklace. Each item was different. Each was broken in its own way, but they all had one thing in common. The inherited echo within them was dying, layer by layer, generation by generation, like paint applied over paint until the wood rots beneath it. And in 3 of the 6 items, David found the same emptiness he'd found in Amber's blade, traces of a drained echo. Someone wasn't just inheriting the echo. Someone was stealing it. So-Yun came every day. She no longer stood in the doorway. She sat on a chair. Sometimes she sharpened her sword. Sometimes she just sat in silence. Sometimes she spoke, a little, sparingly, as if every word cost her effort. She said she became a mercenary at 16, that she was hired as a bodyguard because her echo was strong, unusually strong for an empty. She didn't know why. She was just faster and more precise than the others. And then, 2 years ago, after being wounded in battle, something changed. She was brought to the Vale estate. The healer examined her. She fell asleep, and when she woke up, her echo was dim, as if someone had turned off the light inside. They told her the wound had damaged the pattern, that such things happen, that she was lucky to be alive. She believed them, because there was no reason not to. David listened and remained silent. He didn't tell her what he'd seen on her wrist. Not yet. Not yet. Because you can't fix something whose story you haven't fully understood. And he didn't understand it yet. He knew Echo had been taken, but he didn't know how, and he didn't know by whom. And until he knew, he had nothing to offer her but empty words. And for So-Yun, empty words were worse than silence. Amber took over a corner of the workshop, literally. She dragged a mattress from the stable and settled between the tool shelf and the wall. So-Yun said the workshop was turning into a flop house. Amber replied that flop houses were cozier. They didn't get along, but they weren't enemies. It was like 2 cats in the same room. Circles, circles, cautious sniffing, and a slow acknowledgement of the other's territory. Amber helped, in her own way. She knew metal, knew fire, knew how to read the color of steel by its heat. Her father had taught her, and her hands were quick. David gave her small tasks. Prepare the material, clean the surface, stoke the forge. She did it with fierce concentration, as if every task were a personal insult she had to overcome. Ren came by less often. He worked in the estate's smithy. The head blacksmith still bossed him around, but Ren had changed. He no longer stared at the floor. His father's hammer hung from his belt, and sometimes, when the head blacksmith yelled at him, Ren would put his hand on the hammer and stay silent. He didn't flinch. He remained silent. It was a different kind of silence. On the 32nd day, a woman came into the workshop. David didn't immediately realize she had come for him. She stood at the door. She didn't come in. She just stood there and watched. Thin, exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her hands stained with herbs and ointments, her hair hastily pulled back. The pattern on her wrist was pale, but not empty. Warm, alive, just very faint, as if there had been so much of it, but little remained. Not because it had been taken away, because she had given it away. So-Yun stood up. She knew this woman. She said her name was Ha-Un. a healer from the lower city, that she treated the empty ones for free, that she carries 3 blocks of slums on her back, that everyone knows her and everyone owes her. Ha-un quietly said she wasn't there for treatment, that she was managing. So-yun looked at her and said she was lying. Ha-un smiled faintly and went inside. She didn't sit down. She stood in the middle of the workshop and looked around. Her gaze settled on the bowl, on the blade of amber lying on the shelf, on the seams, on the golden lines. She reached out and touched the seam on the bowl and pulled it away. Her fingers were trembling. She said she could feel the warmth, that the seams were warm, that it was a living echo. David nodded. Ha-un looked at him. Her eyes were dark, tired, but there was something in them that David recognized. The same look. The look of someone who fixes others and forgets to fix themselves. He knew that. He'd lived that way himself for 30 years. She said she hadn't come for herself, that in the lower city the children were sick. Something strange. The echo on their wrists was fading. They're born with a pattern normal for children, faint but alive. And then, within a few weeks, it fades and fades away, as if someone is draining the life from them. She can't stop it. Herbs don't help. Ointments don't help. She's tried everything she knew, and she knew a lot. But this isn't a disease. It's something else. David froze. Children. He looked at So-yun, at Amber, at the blade with its restored rhythm, at the bowl with golden seams, and he looked back at Ha-un. Children are losing their echo. So-yun lost her echo after being wounded. Amber's father's blade lost its echo. The nobility are losing their echo, generation after generation. It's the same thing, the same crack, the same system. He told Ha-un he would come. She looked at him, then at So-yun, then back at him, and asked why. David didn't understand the question, she clarified. Why would he go down to the slums? He is Lord Vale's master. He has a warm workshop. Work. Protection. Why take the risk? Why help those when he could be repairing silver for the nobility? David thought for a moment. Then he said it was because children aren't silver. Ha-un was silent for a long time. Then she nodded and left. So, Yun said that if he went to the lower city, she would go with him. Not because she didn't care, but because a dead master was useless to her and she preferred him to stay alive. Amber said she would go too, and let anyone try to stop her. David looked at the two of them. A mercenary with a faded echo and the daughter of a disgraced blacksmith with her father's blade on her back. 2 broken things that haven't been mended yet, but that are already standing side by side. He thought that would be enough for a start. They reached the lower city at dawn. So-yun walked ahead, a sword at her belt, her eyes scanning every alleyway. Amber walked beside David. She was silent, which was a miracle in itself. David carried a bag of tools, not much, just the essentials. A whetstone, a small hammer, rags, and a bowl. He didn't know why he'd taken the bowl. It just seemed right. The Vale estate stood on a hill. The lower city began at its foot. The transition was abrupt. A stone wall, a gate, guards, and beyond the gate, another world. The streets were narrow, dirty. The houses were low. The walls were cracked. The roofs were patched. The people here were different. Not bustling like the servants at the estate, not haughty like the nobility. Quiet, cautious, like animals accustomed to the fact that any movement could attract a predator. A pale pattern on each wrist, or none at all. Empty. Ha-yun was waiting for them at the entrance to a narrow alley. She looked even worse than yesterday. Her eyes were red. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't slept. She led them deeper into the slums, past workshops where hammers clanged without song, past stalls selling gray bread, past a well with a line of 20 people around it. People glanced at them, at So-Yun with her sword, at Amber with a blade on her back, at David with his dull wrist and tools. No one approached. No one spoke. Ha-Yun led them to a house at the end of the alley, small, 1 story, walls of gray stone, a low door. Inside it was dark and cramped. 1 room, beds along the walls, 7 of them. A child lay on each one. David stopped in the doorway. The children were small, between 5 and 10 years old, thin, pale, eyes open but empty, like windows in a house where no one lives. Patterns on their wrists, pale, fading. A boy of about 7 lay closest to the door. His pattern was almost invisible, like the last ember in a dying fire. Ha-Yun said this boy was Theo, that 3 weeks ago his pattern was normal, that he used to run through the streets and laugh, and then he started to weaken. At first, he'd get tired faster. Then he stopped running. Then he stopped getting up. And now he lies there staring at the ceiling. David sat down next to the boy. He placed his hand on the boy's wrist and closed his eyes. The world opened up, like with a bowl, like with a sword, like with Amber's blade, but different. A person wasn't a thing. A person was alive, and reading him was more painful, much more painful. He saw Theo's pattern, saw the lines fading, saw Echo leaving the body, slowly, steadily, like water from a leaky bucket. And he saw the whole, not a physical one, not a visible one, but a real one. Something was pulling Echo out of the child, as if through an invisible tube, pulling upward. David opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling, then out the window, up the hillside, toward the estate. It was pulling upward, toward the nobility. He checked the second child. Same thing. The third, the fourth, all 7 of them, the same picture. Echo was leaking away, slowly, constantly, upward. He stood up. His hands were shaking, not from fatigue, from what he had seen. So-Yun was standing by the door. She saw his face. She asked what was wrong. David paused. Then he said that someone was pulling the Echo from the children, that it wasn't an illness. It's a ritual, or a mechanism, or something in between. Something is taking the lived experience from those who are weak and dragging it upward to those whose pattern is dense. Ha-Un leaned against the wall. She closed her eyes, and David saw the tension drain from her shoulders. Not relief, confirmation. She had already suspected it, she just couldn't prove it. Amber stood by the cot of the youngest girl, about 5 years old, red-haired, with a wrist on which the pattern was almost invisible. Amber was clenching her fists. Her jaw was clenched. She asked if it could be stopped. David said he didn't know, not yet. He could read cracks, he could mend seams, but here, the crack wasn't in the object, it was in the system, in something bigger than a single house or a single lord. And to fix the system, you first had to understand how it worked. He asked Ha-Un to tell him everything she knew. She told him. The children had started getting sick 2 months ago, all from the same neighborhood, all from empty families. Not a single child from the noble quarters had been affected. She had checked. She had gone around. She had asked. They didn't answer her, or they said their children were perfectly fine. 2 months ago. David asked what had happened 2 months ago. Ha-Un shook her head. Nothing special, just everyday life. So-Yun said that 2 months ago there had been a celebration at the estate. The Day of the Vale family heritage. Annual, grand. Guests flock from all over the county. The Eha priests conduct the pattern renewal ceremony. All the aristocrats place their wrists against the family stone, and their patterns glow brighter. A tradition. They do this every year. David looked at her. The pattern renewal ceremony. Annual. And a few days after it, the children in the lower cities start losing their E. He asked who conducts the ceremony. So-yun said it's a priestess of Echo. One. The same one every year. Her name is Jung-mi-rae. David remembered the name. He stood up. He walked over to the boy, Theo, and did what he could. Not a repair. He didn't have enough understanding for a repair. He made a patch. A temporary one, like a band-aid on a wound. He found the hole through which the echo was leaking and covered it with his own. A thin layer, like filling a crack in a wall to keep the draft out. It didn't solve the problem. The hole was still there, but the leak had slowed. Theo blinked. For the first time in several days, his eyes focused. He looked at David and quietly asked who he was. David said he was a master who repairs things. Theo asked what he was fixing. David said he didn't know yet, but he'd figure it out. He patched the holes on all 7 of them. It took 4 hours. By the end, he could barely stand. The pattern on his wrist had faded. He'd given too much, again. So-yun took his arm when he staggered at the exit. She didn't say anything. She just held him. Amber walked beside them. She was silent too. On the way back through the slums, people looked at them differently. Not with fear. With something else. The woman by the well nodded to David. The old man by the workshop took off his hat. A boy of about 12 ran after them and held out an apple to David. A misshapen one, small. The only one he had. David took it, thanked him. The boy ran off. At the estate gate, So-yun let go of his hand. She took a step back. She became the captain of the guard again, her face closed off, her back straight. But David saw. Her fingers were trembling. Not from exhaustion, from anger. The quiet, cold anger of a person who realized they had been betrayed. She, too, had lost Echo in this estate. After she was wounded, when the healer examined her, when she fell asleep, and when she woke up empty. 2 years ago, after yet another day of the legacy. 3 days after the trip to the lower city, David couldn't work. His body was failing him. His hands couldn't hold a tool. The pattern on his wrist had faded so much it was almost invisible. Just like on the first day. He lay on the workshop floor and stared at the ceiling. So-yun brought him food, silently. She set the bowl down beside him, left, returned an hour later, took the empty bowl. Or the full one. It depended on the day. Amber sat in her corner and sharpened her father's blade. The sound of steel against stone was steady and rhythmic. Ta-ta-tam. She didn't notice she was mimicking her father's rhythm. David did. On the second day, Ren came to him. He brought broth, hot, thick, made from real meat. David didn't ask where it came from. Ren said he'd stolen it from the kitchen. He said it so calmly, as if stealing broth were a common occurrence. Maybe for a servant on the estate, it was. David drank the broth and felt the warmth returning, not in a pattern, into his body. On the 3rd day, he was able to sit up. On the 4th, he stood up. On the 5th, he picked up a hammer. And he realized he had changed. He felt the world differently, deeper, clearer, as if exhaustion had torn away some kind of barrier from his perception. Cracks were now visible everywhere, in the stone of the walls, in the wood of the door, in the metal of the window bars, and in people. He saw cracks in So-yun, fine, deep, running from her wrist to her heart. Traces of the echo that had been scooped out, like the beds of dried-up rivers. He saw cracks in amber, different ones, not from theft, from shame. Shame for her father, shame for her poverty, shame that the world had labeled her family defective. These cracks ran from her throat to her eyes. She hid them behind bravado, but they were there. He saw cracks in Renee, from fear. 10 years of silence. 10 years of downcast eyes. Fear had gnawed into her bones. Her father's hammer had helped, but the fear didn't go away. It just retreated and waited. David stood in the middle of the workshop and saw a broken world, and he understood that he couldn't fix it alone. Not because he was weak, because fixing it required understanding. And he didn't understand the main thing: how Echo's milking system worked, who created it, who controlled it, and how to stop it. He needed a priestess. Mi-Ray. On the 6th day, he asked So-Yoon for a meeting, not with the Lord, with Echo's priestess. So-Yoon looked at him for a long time. Then she said it was a bad idea, that the priestess was part of the Vale system, that she conducted the milking ceremonies, that trusting her meant sticking your neck out. David said he wasn't going to trust her. He was going to listen. So-Yoon shook her head, but she arranged the meeting. Mira came on the 7th day, in the evening, when the estate had fallen silent. She entered the workshop and stopped. David looked at her and read. A woman, 25, maybe a little older. Her face was calm, beautiful, motionless, like a mask. Her hands were long, her fingers were slender. A pattern on her wrist, dense, thick, but strange, as if half the lines were foreign, woven in, not hers. She was like a bowl, covered in a foreign echo. But unlike the bowl, she knew it. Mira surveyed the workshop. Her gaze lingered on the bowl, on Amber's blade, on the seams, on the golden lines. She said she could see his work, that the seams were beautiful, that they were real. David asked how she could tell. She said it was because she had been performing echo rituals for 6 years, and in 6 years she had never seen a real one. Only heirlooms, only dead ones, only stolen ones. Silence hung in the air for a long minute. So-Yoon tensed by the door, her hand on her sword. Amber in the corner stopped sharpening her blade. Mira continued. She said she knew why he had called her, that she knew about the children, that she does it herself, every year, at the renewal ceremony. She stands before the ancestral stone, places her hands on its surface, and draws. Echoes from the lower city, from the empty ones, from those who are weak. She pulls them and pours them into the stone, and the stone distributes them among the nobles, renewing their patterns, with others' echoes. Stolen ones. She spoke evenly, without emotion, as if reading from a script. But David saw her cracks, deep ones, black, running from her hands to her heart. The hands with which she took the foreign echo. The hands that remembered everyone from whom they drew. She hated it, every second of every ritual. But she did it, because if she refused, they would replace her. And the new priestess wouldn't measure it out, wouldn't spare any, wouldn't limit the flow. Mira drew it drop by drop. The next priestess will draw it like a river. She said it was Theo and the other children. It wasn't her. Something had changed in recent months. The birthstone had begun to draw on its own, without a ritual, without a priestess, round the clock, as if the mechanism had broken free from its restraints. She doesn't know why. She tried to slow it down. She couldn't. The stone is too strong. Or too hungry. David listened. He listened as he listened to the bowl, as he listened to the blade, as he listened to the shield. He listened not to the words, but to what lay behind them. And he heard the truth. Mira wasn't lying. Her cracks were cracks of guilt. Real guilt. Deep guilt. 6 years' worth. She didn't come because he called her. She came because she'd been looking for a way out for 6 years. And for the first time, she saw a person who could give it to her. He asked if they could reverse the ritual, not to drag it out, but to bring it back. Mireille froze. Her fingers clenched. She said she didn't know, that the ritual was ancient, that it was created not by priests, but by someone before them, that she was only the performer, not the creator. But what if someone understood how the echo's seams worked? If someone knew how to join and separate? Then it was theoretically possible. She looked at the bowl, at the seams, and said that he was already doing it, on a small scale. Every seam is a return.
Every repair is an echo directed where it needs to go, to an object, to a person, to the one to whom it belongs. David thought, for a long time. Then he said he needed access to the ancestral stone. So Yun said it was madness, that the stone was in the dungeon beneath the estate, that it was guarded, that Cassian would rather kill David than let him near the stone. David nodded. He knew. But he didn't need to touch the stone. He needed to listen to it, to understand how it worked, to read its cracks. Because the stone is also a thing, and every object has a story. Mireille said she could guide him, that the next ceremony is in 3 weeks, that before the ceremony she prepares the stone, alone, in the dungeon. 2 hours. That's enough. So Yun said it's a trap. Mireille looked at her, calmly, and said she knew who had taken Echo So-Yun, that she had done it 2 years ago, on Lord Vale's orders, because Echo So-Yun was too strong, unacceptably strong for an empty one. And the Lord decided that such power should belong to his lineage, not a mercenary. The silence in the workshop became tangible, heavy, like a stone on her chest. So-Yun didn't move, didn't reach for her sword, didn't clench her fists. She just stood there and looked at Mira, her eyes dry, her face blank, like a wall. Mira held her gaze. She didn't look away. She didn't ask for forgiveness, because forgiveness must be earned, and she knew that. Amber, in the corner, slowly placed her hand on her father's blade, not to attack, for support, because the world beneath her swayed. Everything they'd told her about her father's decline, about how his blades had fallen silent of their own accord, about how he'd lost his gift. It was all a lie. He'd been robbed, just as So-Yun had been robbed, just as children are robbed. David stood in the center of the workshop. 4 women surrounded him. The mercenary with the stolen echo, the daughter of the robbed blacksmith, the healer who carries the pain of others, and the priestess who had been a tool of theft for 6 years. 4 broken souls. 4 cracks in a single world. He said 3 weeks was a long time, that the children wouldn't last that long. His patches were temporary. They might hold out for 10 days, maybe less. Mira said she would try to slow the stone, that there were ways, risky ones, but there were ways. David nodded. Then he looked at So-Yun. She stood motionless. Her face was stony. He said quietly that he would fix it. He would fix everything. So-Yun didn't answer. She turned and walked out. The door closed. Her footsteps faded. Amber stood up. She said she would go after her,
David shook his head. He said she shouldn't, that Soyun needed time, that you couldn't mend a crack while it was still bleeding. She needed to let it all out, like a shield. Amber sat back down, reluctantly. Mira stood in the middle of the workshop, arms at her sides, fingers motionless. Her face was a mask, but the cracks were screaming. David said she needed fixing too. Mireille shook her head and said the children first, then everyone else, and she last, if there was anything left to fix. She left, quietly, just as she had come. David was left alone. The bowl on the workbench hummed softly. He pressed his forehead against the cold stone of the wall and allowed himself 10 seconds of weakness. 10 seconds in which he was neither a master nor a restorer, but simply a tired man in a foreign world with a foreign body and a foreign fate. 10 seconds. And then he pushed himself away from the wall,
Sat down at the workbench, and began to think. 3 weeks until the ceremony. 10 days until the patches hold out. 6 items on Cassian's list that he hadn't fixed yet. The Lord who uses him, the stone that devours echo, and 4 people standing side by side for the first time in a long while. It wasn't enough. But he'd worked with less. David didn't wait 3 weeks. The next morning, he sat down at the workbench and laid out everything he knew. The family stone was pulling echo from the void. The priestess performs the ritual once a year, but the stone has begun to act on its own. The patches on the children will last 10 days, maybe less. He needed a way to slow the stone without access to it, and he found the answer in the bowl. The bowl sat on the workbench and hummed softly. David picked it up. He listened. The seams pulsed evenly. His echo lived within them and flowed like blood through veins. And he understood. The seams weren't just connecting fragments. They were creating a network. A small, closed network through which the echo circulated, like water in a fountain. It didn't leak away. It didn't dissipate. It moved in a circle. He thought, if the stone pulls the echo in one direction, upward, toward the nobility, what if he created another network? One that holds the echo in place, doesn't give it away, doesn't hoard it, just holds it, like a dam. He started small. He took one of the unfinished items from Cassian's list, the Daring family ring, a thin one, silver, with a crack along the rim. He repaired it in 2 hours. The seam was thin and even. And then he did something new. He stretched a thin thread of his echo from the ring to the bowl, invisible, thinner than a hair, but alive. The cup and the ring became connected. The echo flowed between them, back and forth, a closed loop. David looked at his work and saw that the seam on the ring had become slightly brighter. The cup hummed a little louder. They amplified each other, like 2 musicians who play together and sound better than they do alone. He understood the principle, and he began to work. For the next 5 days, he barely slept. He repaired the remaining items on the list, the Tain family bracelet, the Fall family ring, the Avros family comb, the Mason family flute, the Lindholm family clasp. 6 items in 5 days, faster than before, not because he was in a hurry, because he understood better. Every crack was clearer, every seam fit more precisely, and into every item he wove a thread, a subtle connection to the chalice, to the ring, to every other repaired item. The network grew. 12 objects, 12 nodes, all connected. They all hold echo together. He didn't know if it would work, but he knew that 12 sources of the living echo in the homes of 12 noble families was not just a repair. It was a counterweight,
The stone pulls the dead echo upward, and his network keeps the living echo in place, like the roots of a tree that keep the soil from slipping away. So Yun watched. She didn't mention what she'd learned from Mira. She didn't mention the stolen echo. She didn't ask questions. But something in her had changed. She'd become sharper. Her movements had become faster, as if anger had released some kind of break inside her. She trained at night. David heard the sword striking a wooden post in the courtyard, hour after hour, strike after strike. And he noticed that her sword sounded different. That very seam he had sealed on the blade, it responded to her anger. It didn't feed on it. It resonated like a tuning fork. On the 6th day, the items were ready, all 12 of them. David laid them out on the workbench, and for the first time, he saw the web in its entirety. Thin golden threads stretched from object to object, invisible to the ordinary eye, but to him, they were as bright as a spiderweb in the morning light. He called for Mira. She came at night. She looked at the web, and for the first time ever, her mask-like face flinched. She said it looked like an ancient pattern. Very ancient. Older than the family stone. Older than the milking ritual. She had seen such a pattern once, in a dungeon beneath the stone, on the wall, carved into the rock thousands of years ago. Someone had already built such a network, before the nobility, before the air echo, before everything. David asked what had happened to that network. Mira said it had been destroyed, that the stone stood on its ruins, that the entire milking ritual was a perversion of the old system. Someone took the network that kept Echo in balance and turned it into a pump that pulls him in one direction. David closed his eyes. There it was. There was the crack he'd been looking for. The world of our Kriya isn't just an unjust system, it's a broken system. Someone took a working mechanism and broke it for their own gain. And ever since, the world has been held together by that breakage. And it's crumbling, slowly, inevitable. He opened his eyes and said he didn't need 3 weeks, he needed 7 days, and he needed help. In the morning, he gathered everyone, Soyun, Amber, Rina, Hayun, Mira, 5 people in a small workshop. He explained the plan. The items on the list must be returned to their owners, all 12, at the same time. When the items are in the 12 homes, the network will close. The living echo will begin to circulate, and the stone would lose some of its pull, not all of it, but enough for the patches on the children to hold. And while the stone is weakened, David and Mireille will go down to it, and David will do what he's always done. He'll listen. He'll read the cracks, and he'll figure out how to fix it. Soyun said it was a suicide mission. David said he didn't have a better plan. Amber said she was in. Ren nodded, silently, her hand on her father's hammer. Hayun said she'd go down to the lower city and check the patches. That she'd be near the children. That if the net didn't work, at least she'd be there. Mide said she'd lead him to the stone, that she knew the way, knew the guards, knew the schedule, and that if they were caught, she would take the blame. Soyun looked at her for a long time, and for the first time since that night when she learned the truth, she spoke to Mide directly. She said she didn't trust her, that she might never trust her, but that if Mide betrayed them, she would find her personally. Mide nodded. She said that was fair. David watched them. 5 people, all broken, all with cracks, but standing together. And he thought that maybe that was the repair. Not in the seams, not in the golden lines, but in the fact that broken people choose to stand side by side. Delivering the 12 items took 2 days. Soyun organized everything. She knew the routes, knew the couriers, knew which guards could be trusted,
and which could not. 4 guards from her squad, former empties whom she had recruited herself. They asked no questions. They knew So-yun, and that was enough. Ren carried 3 items himself: Tarnov's shield, Falov's ring, Tinov's bracelet. He walked through the city with 3 bundles on his back. A former blacksmith's apprentice, an empty, with his father's hammer on his belt. No one paid him any attention. Empties go unnoticed. Amber delivered the harp to the Maywoods. She knocked on the door, and when the maid opened it, she simply handed over the case. She said it was from the master of the Vale estate. The maid took it. She closed the door. Amber stood on the porch and clenched her fists. She wanted to go inside. She wanted to look these people in the face who live on the stolen echo. But she didn't go in, because David had asked her not to draw attention to herself. The last item. The crest of the Avros family. So-yun took it there herself. She stood in front of the Avros family's house. The house was large, beautiful. The fence was high. The patterns on the gate shone. On the stolen echo. She handed the crest to the gatekeeper, turned around, left. Her heels clacked against the stone, steady and angry. By evening of the second day, all 12 items were in place. David sat in his workshop and waited. He could feel the net. Thin threads stretched between 12 points, 12 houses, 12 repaired items, 12 nodes of the living echo. And when the last comb settled on Lady Avros's dressing table, the web closed. David felt it like a sigh. The world sighed, quietly, barely perceptibly, but he heard it. The echo flowed along the threads, from object to object, in a circle, alive, real, a countercurrent. The stone felt it too. David sensed the pull weaken, not much, but noticeably, as if someone had closed a window in a room where there had been a draft. The wind was still blowing, but not as strongly. He stood up. He looked at Mira, who was waiting by the door. He nodded. It was time. They went down to the basement at night. Mira knew the way. 2 turns from the kitchen, down the stairs, a hallway, another set of stairs, another hallway, deeper, colder, darker. Torches rarely burned here. The walls were damp, the ceiling was low. So-yun followed them. She had no intention of staying upstairs. David didn't argue. He knew it was pointless. And he knew she wasn't going for his sake. She was going for herself, for the answer to a question that had been burning inside her for 2 years. The dungeon opened up suddenly. The corridor ended, and they stepped into a cavern, a huge one. The ceiling was lost in the darkness. The walls stretched out to the sides, and in the center stood a stone, the family stone of the Vale clan. David stopped. The stone was large, 3 times a man's height, black, smooth, covered in patterns, dense, bright, pulsating, like the pattern on Cassian's wrist, only 1,000 times denser. The patterns moved, slowly, like snakes beneath the skin. And a sound emanated from the stone, not a hum, not a song, a suction, a quiet, constant suction, like an inhalation that never turns into an exhalation. David stepped closer. He placed his hands on the stone, and the world exploded. Not with light, not with sound, with information. The stone's cracks crashed down on him like an avalanche. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. The stone's history was the history of the world. He saw everything. The ancient network that once kept Echo in balance. Thousands of nodes, thousands of threads. A living organism of connections and flows. Echo flowed freely, from person to task, from task to thing, from thing back to person. A cycle. Balance. Beauty. And then someone broke the central knot. Not by accident, on purpose. Redirected the flows.
Turned the web into a funnel, the cycle into a pump, and called it the inherited echo. And ever since, the stone has been pulling and pulling, century after century, sucking the world dry. And the drier the world, the stronger the stone pulls. Because it isn't enough. Because the stolen echo doesn't satisfy. It's been dead since the moment it was stolen, like water rotting in a sealed vessel. David pulled his hands away. He was shaking. Blood was running from his nose. His eyes couldn't focus. He sat down on the stone floor. So-Yun caught him. Mi-Ra stood nearby. Her face was pale. She had seen something too. Not like David, but enough. David wiped the blood away and said he knew how to fix it. The stone didn't need to be destroyed. It needed to be unwound, returned to its original configuration. The flows redirected back, from the funnel back into the web, from the pump back into the cycle. Mi-Ra asked how. David said the same way as with the bowl. Find the seam, the original one, the one that was broken, and seal it. But for that, he needed echo. A lot of echo. More than one person has. More than the 12 repaired objects have. He looked at So-Yun, at Mi-Ra, and said he needed the empty ones. All the empty ones of the lower city. Everyone who had overcome something at least once in their life, who had lived through something, who had suffered through something. Because their echo is real. Even if there's not much of it, even if it's faint, it's alive. And the living are always stronger than the dead. So-Yun said he was crazy, that you can't bring 100 empties into Lord Vale's dungeon, that they'll be slaughtered on the way. David shook his head. He said they didn't need to go into the dungeon. The network of 12 objects was already working. It was already connected to the stone. Through it, the echo could be directed. All they needed to do was gather people in one place and give them a focal point. Something that would unite their echoes. Something they would all recognize. He looked at his hands, then up, through the stone, through the ceiling, somewhere very far away. And he said he knew what it would be. In the dungeon wall behind the ancestral stone stood an object. Huge, dark, covered in cracks so dense it seemed to consist of nothing but shards. The Bell of Arcria. Silent for 300 years. A symbol of unity that no one had even tried to repair, because they considered it hopeless. David approached the bell. He placed his hands on the cracked bronze, and he heard it. Not a scream, not a moan, a whisper. A quiet, ancient whisper of a thing that remembered a time when the world was whole. David listened to the bell for 3 days. He went down to the dungeon every night. Mi-Ra led him past the guards. So-Yun stood guard at the entrance to the corridor. He sat down in front of the bell. He placed his hands on the bronze and listened. The bell was older than the stone, older than the estate, older than anything David had ever seen in this world. It had been created by the same people who created the ancient network. It was the center of that network, the main node. When it rang, the echo flowed through all the threads, free and even. When it was shattered, the network died, and someone built a stone on the ruins. David read the cracks. There were thousands of them. The bell hadn't just cracked from the blow. It had been broken for a long time, deliberately, layer by layer, generation by generation. Like a bowl, only on a different scale. The bowl was the size of a palm. The bell was the size of a house, and the cracks in it were so deep that it seemed the bronze held together only out of habit. But beneath the cracks, David found what he was looking for. A voice, ancient, alive, not dead after 300 years of silence. Hidden, asleep, waiting. And this voice knew him. Not David the teenager, not the body he inhabited, but David the restorer, the one who repairs, the one who listens, the one who was chosen. On the third night, the voice spoke, not with words, with images. David saw a woman, young, laughing, with hands full of light. She stood before the bell and sang, and the bell sang with her, and the whole world sang. The network vibrated from one end of the continent to the other. The echo flowed like rivers, freely, evenly. Everyone received exactly as much as they gave. Balance, beauty, grace. The name came of its own accord. The bell's voice was the voice of grace, the last shard of the former civilization, the very one that knew the truth about the echo, that the echo cannot be taken away. It cannot be inherited. It cannot be stolen forever. It can only be lived. And Grace waited. 300 years inside the shattered bell. She waited for the one who would hear, the one who knows how to repair not by force, but by mending. She searched for him across worlds, and she found him. A restorer who died saving someone else's repaired object. Because only such a person could understand the bell. Only one who values another's possessions more than his own. David withdrew his hands. Tears streamed down his cheeks. Not from pain, from understanding. He wasn't here by chance. He hadn't been cast here by mistake. He had been called, chosen, not as a warrior, not as a hero, as a master. Because this world needed not a sword, but a restorer. He went up to the workshop. Dawn was breaking through the narrow window. Tools lay on the workbench. Amber was sleeping in the corner. So-Yun was dozing on a chair, her hand on her sword, even in her sleep. He sat down at the workbench, and he began to count. The bell is enormous. There are thousands of cracks. His echo won't be enough. The echoes of all the empty souls of the lower city won't be enough. To repair the bell, everyone is needed. Everyone who has ever lived through something. Everyone who got back up after falling. Everyone who saw a task through to the end. The whole city is needed, both the upper and lower cities. And the nobility, too. Because even in the nobility's inherited echo, there are grains of the real, somewhere deep down, beneath layers of the dead. Some of the aristocrats had lost loved ones. Some had battled illness. Some have loved truly. These grains are alive, and they can be awakened. He realized his plan was madness, that Cassian would never allow it, that the nobility would stand as a wall, that they would kill him before he reached the bell with people at his back. And then he decided not to hide. He went to Cassian himself, in the morning, openly. He knocked on the office door. He entered. Lord Vale was sitting at his desk. A smile, a soft voice. The pattern on his wrist pulsed. David placed 12 notes on the table, confirmations from each house that the items had been received and were working. He said the list was complete, all 12. Cassian looked over the notes, nodded, said he was impressed, that the master had earned his title, that from this day forward, David was a free master of House Vale. David said he wanted more. Cassian raised an eyebrow. David said he wanted to repair the bell. Silence. Cassian looked at him.
The smile remained, but his eyes had changed. They had grown cold, sharp, like a blade. He asked why. David said it was because the bell was broken, and he fixed broken things. Cassian leaned back in his chair. He said the bell had been silent for 300 years, that dozens of masters had tried to repair it, that they had all failed, that it was impossible. David said they had told him the same thing about the chalice. Cassian was silent for a moment. Then he said, Let's say he allows it. What would the House of Vale get? David said glory. That the house that repaired the bell of Arcria would go down in history. That everyone would know the Vales had patronized the master who accomplished the impossible. He was playing the only chord that worked with Cassian. Power, status, reputation. Cassian thought, for a long time. Then he said that if David repaired the bell, he would do it publicly, in front of the entire capital, in the square, so everyone could see. So the glory would go to the House of Vale. David agreed. That was exactly what he wanted. Publicly, in the square, in front of everyone, in front of every soul in the lower city, in front of every aristocrat, in front of the whole world. Cassian didn't know what he was signing. He saw a tool, a useful thing, a craftsman who would bring him glory. He didn't see the network of 12 nodes already operating in the homes of his allies. He didn't feel the stone in the dungeon weakening. He didn't understand that the bell in David's hands would become not a symbol of the whale's greatness, Ilov, but a death sentence for the entire system. David left the office. He walked down the hallway. He went down to the workshop. So-Yun looked up. She looked at him. He said that in 10 days they would repair the bell, in the town square, in front of everyone. So-Yun was silent for a long time. Then she said that he was either a genius or an idiot, and that she hadn't decided which yet. Amber said she had decided. A genius, definitely. Ren silently took his father's hammer from his belt and placed it on the workbench. Ready. Ha-Un, who had come in the morning to check on David after nights in the dungeon, quietly said that the children were holding up, that the patches were working, that the stone's pull had weakened, and that, if that was true, in 10 days, everything would change. Mira stood by the door, quiet, calm, with cracks that, for the first time in 6 years, had begun to lighten. She said she knew how to prepare the stone, that it would weaken it further, that by the day of the ceremony, the ancestral stone would be so weak that Cassian himself would feel it. And then he would have no choice. He would need the bell. He would think the bell would save his power, but in reality, the bell will destroy the very idea of that power. David looked at them. 6 people in a small workshop, each one broken, each one with a crack. A mercenary whose power was stolen, the daughter of a blacksmith who was destroyed, a blacksmith who was trampled, a healer who carries the world on her shoulders, a priestess who for 6 years was a weapon against her own people, and a restorer from another world who died saving a stranger's chest. Broken, every single one of them, but standing together. And that made them stronger than those who were whole. 10 days of preparation passed in a flash. The bell was hoisted from the dungeon. It took 20 men and a pulley system designed by Ren. He stood below and gave orders in a quiet voice, without shouting. But they listened to him, because he knew what he was doing. A master's hands don't lie. The bell was installed in the town square, a huge bronze colossus covered in cracks like old leather. People stopped and watched. They were silent. Many didn't know what it was. The young had never seen the bell. The old remembered the stories. That it used to ring. That the sound could be heard from one end of the city to the other. That then it fell silent, and everything got worse. Cassian organized an event. He invited the nobility, all 12 houses and a dozen more on top of that. Stands, tents, flags bearing the Vale pattern. He turned the repair into a spectacle, his own spectacle. He stood on a platform next to the bell. A smile, a soft voice, the pattern shone. He gave a speech. He said that the House of Vale patronized the great master, that today the world would witness the impossible, that the bell of Arcria would ring again, thanks to the generosity and wisdom of the Whale clan. The crowd listened. The nobility in the stands, the townspeople in the square, and the empty ones. Hundreds of empty ones. They stood behind the fence, behind the line drawn by the guards. But they had come. Ha-Yun had brought them. Quietly, without slogans. She simply said that the master would repair the bell. And they came. The children, too. Theo stood next to Ha-Yun, pale, thin, but on his feet, the bandages held. David stepped out onto the square, alone, a skinny teenager in plain clothes, with a faint pattern on his wrist. Next to the bell, he looked like an ant next to a mountain. The hall, that is, the square, unmoved. Cassian watched from the platform. His smile was in place. His confidence was in place. He was convinced that David would either succeed and bring glory to the Whalens, or fail and be destroyed as an impostor. Both options suited him. David placed his hands on the bell. He closed his eyes and began to listen. Thousands of cracks, thousands of stories, 300 years of pain, 300 years of silence. And beneath it all, Grace's voice, quiet, warm, waiting. He began with the largest crack, the one that ran from top to bottom, the main one, the first one, the one where the destruction began. He directed warmth from his wrist into the bronze. The seam smoothed out into a thin, golden line, and David felt a network of 12 objects respond. 12 nodes in 12 houses flared up. The living echo flowed along the threads toward the square, toward the bell, toward his hands. He was not alone. Every repaired object gave off a drop of echo, and the drops merged into a stream. But it was not enough. 1,000 cracks, 12 objects, a drop in the ocean. He opened his eyes. He looked at the square, at the empty spaces beyond the fence, at Ha-Yun, at Theo, at the hundreds of people with dull wrists. And he spoke, loudly, so that the whole square could hear. He said he couldn't repair the bell alone, that no single master could, that the bell was made for everyone, and everyone must repair it. He said that the echo isn't blood, not an inheritance, not a gift of the chosen. The echo is what you've lived through. Every morning when you get up, even though you don't want to. Every day when you work, even though you're tired. Every time you didn't break, even though you could have. That is the echo, and everyone has it. The square was silent. Cassian on the platform wasn't smiling. For the first time, his eyes were cold. He understood. Too late, but he understood. This isn't a reform. It's a rebellion. Not with swords, not with blood, with truth. He raised his hand. He wanted to give the order, to stop it. But So-Yun stood between him and David, a sword in her hand, a blade with a golden seam. She wasn't threatening. She was just standing there. And the Lord saw that Amber stood behind her, with her father's blade at her back, and Ren with a hammer, and Mi-Ra
his own priestess, standing not beside him, but between him and the master. And he saw that the guards weren't moving, the 4 former Void Ones from So-Yun's squad. They stood and looked at the bell, at the master, at their own dull wrists, and didn't move. David turned toward the bell and called out, not with words, with an echo, with his own small, dim echo. He had poured everything into the bronze, 30 years of manual labor, thousands of hours with glue and a brush, hundreds of saved objects, the burning workshop, the beam, the darkness, and waking up on the cold stone floor, and life after. Every repair, every seam, every person he listened to, the bowl, the sword, the hammer, the blade, a shield, a harp, children, So-Yun, Amber,
Rina, Haun, Mira.
everything. The seam glowed, and the bell trembled. For the first time in 300 years, a sound burst from the bronze. Not a ring, not a hum. A call. Quiet, deep, like a voice calling home. And the empty ones heard it. Theo was the first to respond, a 7-year-old boy with an almost invisible pattern. He raised his hand, slender, childlike, and the pattern on his wrist flashed, faintly, barely noticeable, but it flared. Because Theo got up from his cot every day even though he couldn't. Every day he opened his eyes even though he wanted to sleep forever. And that was his echo. Tiny, but alive. After him, the woman by the well responded, the very one who had nodded to David a week ago. Then the old man by the workshop. Then the boy with the apple. One after another. 10, 20, 50, 100. Wrists flashed in the crowd like sparks in the dark. Dim, weak, but real. And every spark flowed toward the bell. Through the network, through 12 nodes, along the threads of the living echo. David stood with his hands on the bronze and felt the cracks closing, one after another, seam by seam. Not his echo, the collective one. Mira stepped forward. She placed her hands on the bell next to his. She knew the ritual, knew how to direct the flows. And for the first time in 6 years, she directed them not upward toward the nobility, but outward, to everyone. Her hands trembled. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she didn't stop. So-Yun stood by the bell. She didn't touch it. She just stood there, and her wrist, faded, empty, suddenly twitched. A thin line appeared on her skin. One, then another. Not a returned echo. A new one. Her own. Born of 2 years of pain, 2 years of anger, 2 years of resilience. She stood there and looked at her hand, and she couldn't believe it. Amber stood beside her, her father's blade in her hand, and the blade sang. Ta-ta-tam, ta-ta-tam. The blacksmith's rhythm, the rhythm her father had lived. Ren held the hammer, and the hammer rang out, quietly, steadily, like a small bell inside a large one. The cracks were closing. 100, 500, 1,000. The seams fell into place one after another. Golden lines covered the bell like a map of rivers on a bronze globe. Every seam was someone's lived experience, someone's overcome struggle, someone's hard-won victory. Cassian stood on the platform. He looked at his pattern, dense, bright, shining, and he saw it fading, slowly, inexorably. The stolen echo could not withstand the true sound, just as a forgery cannot stand comparison with the original. He raised his hand to his wrist. The pattern crumbled away, like dust, like old varnish, like a lie that had been mistaken for the truth for far too long. His wrist became bare, clean, empty. And he finally saw what they had hidden for centuries, that beneath the stolen pattern, they had nothing. That their greatness was built on the lives of others, that the foundation was stolen. The bell rang. The bell rang and the world listened. The sound traveled in waves, not just across the square, across the city, across the region, across the entire continent. David felt it through the network. 12 nodes flashed one after another like lighthouses on the shore, and from each lighthouse came a wave, not destructive, purifying, like water washing away dirt. The inherited echo rained down everywhere. In the mansions of the nobility, the patterns on their wrists faded and crumbled. Someone screamed. Someone fell to their knees. Some stared silently at the empty skin and could not breathe. Things that had clung to the dead echo for centuries cracked and faded. Old blades crumbled into rusty dust. Amulets lost their luster. Family stones across the continent fell silent, one by one. The pump stopped. The funnel turned. And the echo flowed back. To those from whom it had been taken. Not immediately. Not entirely. What has been stolen cannot be fully returned. What one person has lived through cannot be transplanted into another. But space can be freed up. The dead can be removed, and the living can be allowed to grow. In the square, David stood with his hands on the bell. He could feel every seam, thousands of seams, each one someone's echo. And he could feel grace. The voice in the bronze grew clearer, louder, warmer. She was laughing. For the first time in 300 years. Not out of joy, out of relief. 300 years of loneliness, 300 years of waiting. And now someone had come. Not a warrior, not a hero, a master. One who listens before he repairs. David smiled and took his hands away. The bell rang on its own. It no longer needed the warmth of another. It had enough of its own. Thousands of lives fused into bronze. Thousands of seams that are stronger than the whole. The square was silent. The ringing of the bell filled the entire space, not deafening, soft, like a voice that says what you've always known but were afraid to say. Cassian stood on the platform, his wrist bare. His face was pale. He looked at David, and David saw his cracks. Deep, old, beneath the lifeless pattern. Cassian was no monster. He was a broken thing. A man who had carried someone else's echo his whole life and believed it was his own. Who had built his greatness on a foundation he knew was stolen. Who had convinced himself that hierarchy was mercy. Because admitting the truth meant admitting that his whole life had been a lie. David took a step toward the platform. So Yun tensed, his hand on his sword. But David shook his head. He walked over to Cassian, looked up at him. A skinny teenager and a lord. An empty shell and a former aristocrat. And he held out his hand. Not to strike, to shake hands. Cassian stared at the outstretched hand for a long time. The square watched them. The commoners behind the fence, the nobility in the stands, the guards, the servants, everyone. David said that there is no repair without a crack, that every seam begins with a break, and that if Cassian wants, David can show him how to live out his echo. The present. Not inherited, not stolen. His own. Cassian didn't take the hand. He lowered his head, turned away, and walked off the platform. Slowly, heavy, like a man who had been carrying something enormous and suddenly realized there was nothing left to carry. David lowered his hand. He wasn't upset. Repair isn't quick. He had made an offer. The rest depends on Cassian. Maybe he'll come back, maybe not, but the offer stands, like an open door. So-Yoon approached him. She looked at her wrist. 3 thin lines, new ones, her own. She said it was strange, that she felt them differently than before. Before, the pattern was like clothing, worn on the outside, but these lines were like bones, from the inside. David nodded, because what has been lived is always from the inside. Amber stood nearby, her father's blade in her hand. The blade was no longer dull and lifeless. It glowed, with a warm reddish light, the light of the forge. And she held it not as a weapon, but as a memory. She said she wanted to forge,
That she wanted to continue what her father had started.
that if Echo is forged by labor, then she was ready to work. Every day, as long as it takes. David said he would need a blacksmith. Amber said he was looking in the wrong direction and nodded toward Ren. Ren stood a little way off, a hammer in his hand. He looked at the square, at the people, at the wrists that glowed with a dim but vivid light, at the children walking toward the bell and touching it with their palms, at Theo, who stood by the bronze wall and pressed his cheek against it. And Ren smiled. For the first time in all the time David had known him. Ha-Yoon sat on the steps of the square. She didn't stand up when the bell rang. She stayed seated, because her legs wouldn't hold her. Because for the first time in years, she felt she didn't need to run anywhere, didn't need to drag, didn't need to save. The bell is ringing. The children stand up. The world is being mended. And she can just sit there. David walked over to her, sat down beside her, and said she needed some rest. She smiled wryly, said she didn't know how to rest, that she'd forgotten how. David said that was a crack too, and that he could help.
Ha-Yoon looked at him, and for the first time, she allowed herself to be weak. She rested her head on his shoulder, heavy, tired, and closed her eyes. David sat motionless. He didn't move. Because the healer who cures everyone had, for the first time, allowed someone to take care of her. And this repair couldn't be rushed. Mide stood by the bell, her hands on the bronze, her eyes were closed. She felt the currents. The network was working, not like a pump, like a web. The echo flowed freely, smoothly, in both directions, as intended, as it had been 300 years ago. And her hands, the very ones that had taken away for 6 years, now they were giving back. She opened her eyes. She looked at her palms. The cracks in them glowed, gold, like the seams on the bowl. Her guilt hadn't disappeared, but it had become a seam, a place of strength. Because only those who know how to break truly know how to fix. Grace sang in the bronze, quietly, gently. A melody no one had heard in 300 years. David heard it, and he knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The bell was repaired. The stone was stopped. The truth has been revealed. But the world cannot be mended in a single day. Knowledge had lost its stolen echo, and now stood on empty wrists.
Some of them will break. Some will grow bitter. Some will start fighting. And some will come to him, to the Master, with an outstretched hand, just as he had reached out to Cassian, and will say that she wants to live out her echo, truly, like Lily Vance, Cassian's daughter, a 17-year-old girl with a fading hereditary pattern.
She stood at the edge of the square, pale, frightened, with a bare wrist on which the last fragment of the family pattern had just crumbled. And she did not run after her father. She stood and looked at the bell, at the seams, at the golden lines that were more beautiful than any hereditary pattern. And she took a step forward. David saw her crack. The fear of falling, the fear of becoming empty. And he saw the beginning of the seam, because she took a step. One step. This is already lived. This is already an echo. By evening, the square had emptied. The bell stood in the center, covered in thousands of golden seams, glowing softly in the twilight, humming quietly, alive. David sat before it on the stone slabs. His people were around him. So-Yun was sharpening her sword, a habit, a ritual, but now she did it relaxed, without tension. Amber was arguing with Ren about which metal was best for fine forging. Ren answered in monosyllables, but he answered. Ha-Yun was sleeping on the steps. Someone had covered her with a blanket. Mira sat a little way off, apart. She wasn't part of the circle yet, but she was nearby, and that was the beginning. David watched them. The broken people gathered around the repaired bell, and he thought of the workshop. Not the one at the Vale estate, his own, the real one, there, in the lower city, among the empty ones. A school, the workshop, a place where anyone could come and learn. Not magic, not combat. Repair. Themselves, others, the world. It would take years, maybe decades. Repair isn't quick. He knew that better than anyone. But he also knew that the longest job begins with a single stitch, and the first stitch had already been made. The bowl on the workbench in the empty workshop hummed quietly in unison with the bell, as if it knew, as if it had always known, that a small repair and a big one are one and the same. Grace whispered from the bronze, quietly, so that only he could hear. She said, "Thank you." David replied that it was nothing, that he was just doing what he knew how to do, repairing. And for the first time, he thought that maybe he had repaired himself, too. Not completely. The seams still hurt, the cracks are still visible. But they glow, like the bowl, like the bell, like everyone who allowed themselves to be broken and didn't give up. The bell rang softly in the twilight, over the city, over the world, over everything. And somewhere, far away at the edge of the continent, a blacksmith with an empty wrist raised his hammer and struck, and the steel sang.